Today is Wednesday, December 3rd, 2025. My name is Regina Williams, and we are here in the African American History Gallery of the Western Reserve Historical Society. Thank you, Dr. Doris Evans, for agreeing to be our narrator today.
You're very welcome.
I also want to say for the record that our videographer is Miss Catherine Young, and she is with Cleveland Public Library, the People's University. Please start by stating your complete name, first, middle, and last, and your profession.
I'm Doris Anita Evans, and I'm a pediatrician and pediatric cardiologist.
Thank you very much. And how long have you worked as a pediatrician?
Well, somehow I knew you'd ask that question, and I'm never able to give the answer because in my whole work life and study life, I never counted the years. I was simply filled with joy to be doing what I was doing, learning. But many of my parents and patients in my practices would ask that question, and I'd have to stop and actually count the years. And I think they were always mystified by that because some young people would say, "Oh, it takes so long to be a doctor." And I would say, "You won't notice if you're really enjoying what you're doing." So if you want me to labor over that right now, I can do it.
Well, eventually, I think it's going to come out in our conversation today.
Yeah.
But I would like to talk about your early life and education, including when you make that decision about becoming a pediatrician. So, can you tell us about your early life?
Oh, I'm delighted to do that. I started saying I was going to be a physician, and I think I used that word, when I was a little less than 5 years old. And of course, I was met by my family with, "Oh, wonderful, honey. You'll do it. We'll do whatever we can to help you do it." So I think when you're that young saying you want to do that kind of work, it's a mystery in a way. How did that happen? And as I've grown older and thought of it many times, I just have felt that I was called. Now, something happened around that time that I think had some bearing on it. It was on a Sunday afternoon, late afternoon, and I was outside playing with my sister and cousins. And I came in, and my mother was preparing dinner. And I said, "Mama, Mama, I just had a conversation with God." And I was less than 5 at that time. So I'm not sure which came first, my saying I was going to be the doctor or this hallucination. Now, she knew that meant I was sick. And so she, put her hand on my forehead. I was burning up. And I was taken into the hospital, the famous Provident Hospital in Chicago, where they said to my mother they wanted her to sign a permission for me to go to surgery because they thought I had appendicitis. And my mother said, "Nope, I'm not going to sign anything until her pediatrician arrives." And he was a very famous pediatrician, probably the only black one on the south side of Chicago. And his name was Edward Beasley, Dr. Edward Beasley. And Dr. Arthur Burns, who was of great note here in this town, knew him. And I found that out much, much later, obviously. Why am I telling you all this? I think all of these things were related and somehow in my understanding that I was going to be a physician. That response my mother had was about trust. She trusted Dr. Beasley. And actually, I didn't have appendicitis. I had a strep throat. And had they taken me with a nearly 107 fever to the operating room, it could have been tragic. But I stayed in the hospital 2 days. In this day, I would never have been admitted, I don't think. But, back then they did things differently. And I don't remember that experience fondly. That was a time when parents couldn't stay overnight. So I remember that I was alone in this sort of ward in a bed all by myself. So it was kind of meaning there were no other patients in that room. And so that part was not positive, I don't think. Maybe it left in me, maybe there's a better way to do this, I don't know. So that's how I think it got shaped, this dedication to becoming a physician. And I never changed that. I mean, nothing ever came, no alternatives were ever entertained. So I think from a very early time, I was pledged, to be becoming a doctor. So that illness became a sort of pattern. Not that I got that ill ever again or had another hallucination, but my sister and I had colds all the time. So we were delayed in starting school, and many of my aunts were school teachers. My mother knew she wanted to be a teacher and later did become a teacher, but we got a lot of teaching at home. And my grandparents were highly educated. My grandfather and grandmother met in college, at a college where her dad was a professor at Texas Polk College. So we didn't start school until we were almost 7. And that brings me to another interesting chapter. I love John Lewis, the congressman, the late congressman, who said, cause good trouble. Well, because we had had all of this teaching at home, we went to starting in kindergarten, and we really were advanced, my sister and I. And my mother felt that the teacher at the school wasn't helping us particularly. So she took us out and entered us into Howelton Day School, which was a very famous school in Chicago. It lasted 50 years. I think it opened in 46 and closed in 1999. So we were one of the very first children to go to that school. But they was formed by an exceptional group of black women teachers who thought the education for black children in the south side of Chicago was terrible. So my mother, though we had very few pennies to rub together, and my parents had divorced by that time, somehow we had the means to go to Howelton Day School. And that was formative in many ways. Joe Lewis's children went there, so we got to meet Joe Lewis and his ex-wife. And Joe Louis Barrow, Jr. Joe Lewis was actually Joe Louis Barrow, but his son was Joe Louis Barrow, Jr. So we got to know him. And then much later now, 50 years, 60 years later, I run into Joe Louis Barrow, Jr., who was head of First Tee. So we got to revisit lots of things, but we stayed at Howelton Day 1 year and then went back to public school. We had adjusted well, and we stayed in elementary school. Maybe we got double promoted a few times. So I went to high school when I was, that is 10th grade, when I was 12. And that was the public Parker High School in Chicago. And then we left high school at 16, and I went to the University of Chicago and finished there when I was 20, and then came to Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. So that's an overview of education. Now, I think I'm who I am, as each of us is, by virtue of to whom we were born and the circumstances of our early lives and later lives. In addition to my wonderful family that gave me such wonderful support, I had so many marvelous teachers, just one after another, at every level. I left out part of my early life as my mother was getting settled after the divorce. My sister and I went a couple of times to stay with our grandparents in Queens, Long Island, New York. And we stayed a year each of those times and went to school there. Second grade, I think it was, and fifth grade. So that was another exposure. My grandparents were wealthy, and we lived in a racially integrated neighborhood, which was a good experience to have. Neighbors that were like us in how they looked and who weren't like us. But we learned a lot, from that. But one thing that was really great was Count Basie lived right down the street. And he would, on Sunday, give concerts for the kids in the neighborhood. They had a glassed-in porch, and he would sit out there and play the piano and talk with us. And Duke Ellington's son lived across the street. So it was so enriching, all of that. And then, my favorite high school teacher was Dorothy Dix Wallace. And I stayed friends with her until she was 96 years old. I could go on and on with this, but I think we need to go to other things.
No,
But these were people that, really influenced me and supported my desire to be excellent and to, get to medical school and become a physician.
Well, you share with us a wonderful overview of your learning journey from the earliest years of your childhood through medical school here in Cleveland, Ohio, at Case Western Reserve University. But I'd like to go back, if I may, for a few minutes to the south side of Chicago, which has a rich history. And we hear about Bronzeville. We hear about, do we call him the Brown Bomber? Is that Joe Louis? Yeah, I think I've seen that in history books. But these teachers on the South Side who recognize that education is important enough that if it isn't happening in an excellent way in a public school, we can start an alternative school. But could you spell the name of the school on the South Side of Chicago? Because I don't think I'm familiar with that at all.
Howelton, Howalton. And if you Google it, you'll find a lot about it.
Wonderful.
It was marvelous. And, it fell upon disrepair, neighborhoods changed. So they initially attracted people of some means, But as schools got better, as the public schools got better, there was less demand. Then it moved to far south side, trying to recapture its early history of serving children who could benefit from that kind of education. It was probably a Montessori model in a way. They didn't call it that, but they were able to give the individual attention that different children needed. But sooner or later, and we'll come to this later, it's similar to the Forest City Hospital situation. In a way, happily, it was no longer needed because the public system had responded, maybe not excellently, but in a much better way.
Okay, but thank you for the spelling and the clarification regarding the history of Howelton Day School.
Yes.
Okay, but again in Chicago, you've mentioned growing up with a sister and cousins and a mother and an extended family that included grandparents in Queens, Long Island, New York. But would you like to share the names of some of your family members, immediate and extended, for the record?
My mother was Queen Esther. My grandfather was a bishop in his church, so almost all of the 9 children had a biblical name. So my mother was Queen Esther. McGee was the family name, M-C-G-E-E. My Aunt Doris, after whom I am named, was the firstborn child of the 9. Actually, there were 10, and the first child was stillborn, but of all the living children, she was the firstborn. And my namesake, as I said, my Aunt May, and then I had 5 uncles, Uncle Bill, Uncle Sally, Uncle Paul, Uncle Ed, and Uncle Bubba. And all of them made their mark in life in a good way. Maybe not first off, but second off. A couple of them needed some second chances. But we were a close family. I mean, I knew everybody. My Aunt May was just marvelous. She was, you had to say one aunt or another is a favorite aunt. They were favorite for different reasons. She was very in tune to me and my, I think, inner life and the things that were important to me. And my mother was too, but my mother just had different concepts of what I might do sometimes with my time. Like she wanted us to be musically inclined. Aunt May sort of wanted to invest in what I was invested in. So I said the only professional aspiration I had was to be a doctor. But I began playing golf when I was 12, and she knew that I was passionate about that. So she would go to the golf course with me sometimes and just tag along, you know. And I became a good golfer. I was a junior competitive golfer and traveled all around different states playing in tournaments. But I had this mild anxiety about competition, which she discerned. So I would maybe get a bogey on a hole, which is one worse than par. But she would write the par down on the card. And I'd say, well, Aunt May, I made a bogey. She said, no, you made a par. You should have made a par. So I'm putting a par down there. So that's how she was, and I just loved her. And she was a home economics teacher, so she made a lot of our clothes when we were young. My mother was always had high aspirations, like all of the family members. But everybody in my family practically was musically talented at a very high level, including my grandparents, who both played the piano and sang. I didn't inherit that.
Oh.
I played lots of instruments trying to find what was the instrument for me. When I was in my 60s or late 50s, I discovered it was my voice. Okay. And there were glimmerings of that when I was little, but I felt so inhibited by the excellence of of musicality in my aunts and uncles that I didn't feel free to express it. But my mother, I think if she had a disappointment in me, it was that I just couldn't seem to master something musical. Because my mother could hear a song, any song, classical, popular, sit down, play it. She also read music. They all took music lessons. So and then my Aunt Doris was really a concert-level pianist. And all of us in here know about Paul Robeson. When Paul Robeson came back to the United States, he was still being maligned, called a communist. When he would concertize and go around the country, he would need to find an accompanist. In many cities, he couldn't find one because people didn't want to be associated with him. But he came to Oklahoma, and my Aunt Doris accompanied him. So that was, it was important because she had the high level of musicianship to do it, but it also was a lesson to me that living a life of courage is a good life. And she had courage to do it. She could have gotten fired. She was a school teacher at that. But she didn't. Nothing bad happened. But it was just such a good object lesson, you know. Make good trouble. So I knew about that long before I heard John Lewis say, you know, anything about that. Now you asked about the South Side. My grandfather, the bishop, moved to Chicago to establish a church. Now, what year would that have been? It was probably 1930-ish. And so they didn't start in Chicago. Many of the children had been born by the time they moved to Chicago and established the McGee Temple of Church of God in Christ. And their home was right across the street from there and like 3 blocks from Providence Hospital on Vincennes. But we spread out, you know, ultimately we spread out over the South Side. My family, you know, after my mother and father divorced, we moved many times. I went to a total of 7 different elementary schools, including the one in New York. And why was that? We were trying to do better. My mother observed that, and all of my relatives, In poor black neighborhoods, food prices were higher. Schools were worse. So we were, and as my mother went back to finish her college education and later her master's, because when she married my father, she dropped out of college. But we kept moving, trying to improve our circumstances. Now that had great benefit. It also was hard. And, but we got through it, and mostly I was laser focused on becoming a doctor. So I don't know, we could say a lot about the South Side. It had wonderful ribs. And then it had a restaurant called the Tropical Hut, which was a special treat for us. We didn't go out very much. But when my mother remarried, my stepfather, my mother and sister and I, favorite restaurant was right in Hyde Park, within the University of Chicago campus, really. And it was so popular, you couldn't get a reservation. You had to just go and wait, sometimes an hour or so. The food was delicious. It was not soul food, it was like, oh, I don't know what you would call it. A sort of an adulterated Asian style food. So that's, I don't know what else I might tell you about the South Side. Had good golf courses that I played sometimes. Many people knew my passion for golf and think that I played golf a lot. I didn't, except between 12 and 16 when I did this junior competitive golfing. But once I went to the University of Chicago, I couldn't get A's at U of C and A's in golf. Mm-hmm. So I gave golf up for almost 20 years and then came back to it long after I had been settled here in Cleveland.
Okay. Well, before we get too far away from the South Side of Chicago, you mentioned your sister and your schooling, and then you move and she moves, and so she gets advanced 2 grades and you advance with her. Yeah. Can you mention her name and tell us a little bit about her?
My identical twin sister is Dr. Dorothy Holmes. She has a PhD in clinical psychology, and she's a psychoanalyst and a training and teaching analyst. And she, just like I this year, has retired her license, so she won't be seeing patients anymore, but she will be doing her academic consulting work. And she married, and sadly, my brother-in-law died in 2018, but I called him my best brother, and he called me his best sister. He was a lovely man, and they had a lovely marriage. My sister lives in Bluffton, South Carolina, which is where they had lived for so many years. Actually, he worked for the Federal Reserve Bank and retired. He was 6 years older than we, so he retired long before she retired and settled down there in the home that they built. And she commuted for 10 years from Washington, D.C., which is where they both had their professions. For 10 years she did that. And then she left Washington, D.C., but opened a practice in Bluffton, South Carolina. So now she is retired from that practice of seeing patients. So we didn't go to the same schools, colleges, or graduate schools, except 1 year she lived here, because when you get your PhD in clinical psych, you have to do a year of clinical work. So she chose to do her year here at what used to be called the Hannah Pavilion Hospital, which was the psychiatric hospital for Case Western Reserve University, which is no longer like so many psychiatric hospitals. It closed. But during that year, the year that she came here was 66 to 67, that's where she did her clinical work.
And mentioning all of the relatives' names, it's nice to know, in case you mention a name again, that there's more than one Doris in the family, and I'll have to ask you which one did that. But Dorothy and Doris are the twin girls. Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much. Now, there's another name that you mentioned. It's the name of that famous hospital in Chicago, the Provident Hospital, and you remember going there as a child.
Yes.
So can
Well,
you
that time when I was so sick. Yeah. Yeah.
can you tell me a little bit about the history of that institution in your family's life or generally in the community itself of Black Americans?
Well, Chicago was like Cleveland and like so many other cities, broken in terms of racial issues. And care was not generally available for blacks in so-called white hospitals. So I would think it was Daniel Hoyle Williams that founded Provident Hospital. And he, much like the group here, he got a group of doctors together, raised the money, and it was a so-called black hospital. Now, it had some parallels with Forest City here, but not exactly. He wanted, in the bylaws of the hospital, make it clear it wasn't a black hospital. He didn't want it to be conceived that way. He wanted it to be open to all qualified people, white, black, whatever. Turned out there that over 90% of the physicians were black, whereas interestingly here at Forest City Hospital, that wasn't true. About half of the physicians were white here at Forest City. But anyway, it was, one of my cousins was born there. My sister and I were born at the Cook County Hospital. But we all knew about it. And, you know, I think every black doctor on the South Side had privileges there. Increasingly, as hospitals opened, other hospitals opened, with opportunities for doctors of color, Provident Hospital began to decline in terms of the number of patients admitted and really fell on hard times. But now it's a sort of South Side giant because it has a collaboration with I think, the county hospital system. And we had a reunion there 3 years ago, our family, and so we went by to see it. It's new now, you know, it's not the same Provident Hospital where I was that young child in a room all by herself, freezing. I remember it was the coldest place. And I think it has a fairly good reputation. But, you know, it represents in one way, I think, good and bad. Good that it could be done, bad that it needed to be done. In other words, in my view, you know, some of the pain of our and legacy of our enslavement was just terrible. And even though it was considered a good enough hospital for a city, Provident, you know, while they had some things that were excellent, they didn't have the same facilities as other hospitals did. The history isn't recorded quite accurately, and I've read I don't know how many things about it. But actually, there was a deliberate effort to build this Forest City Hospital so black doctors wouldn't want to clamor to come to these other hospitals. So whether it was Mount Sinai, University Hospitals, and the others in this town, they all contributed money to this, what was it called, the Forest City Fund or something, Association Fund, so the hospital could be built. And that isn't spelled out in a lot of detail, but that was the true story. Of course, with the pressure of time and the civil rights movement, whether it's Chicago or here, all those problems became less and less. And I'll never forget a breakfast I had at Lakeside Hospital with Ed Wilkerson, you know that name? And he was a great surgeon. I mean, just without question, he was a great surgeon. And he was the only black surgeon with privileges at Lakeside Hospital at that time. And we were sitting there talking about all this history and its impact on folks. And so I kept hearing him being paged. Dr. Wilkerson, in those days, we didn't have cell phones or anything. I said, do you hear your name being paged? He said, oh yeah, they want me in surgery. But, you know, they expect black people to be late. So, I thought it was humorous in a way, that he wanted to, I don't know what it was all about exactly, but I think it was his anger, really. And, but he wasn't going to be on time, So finally he left and went there. And I never had a time to really talk with him deeply, about that. But, that was part of the hurts of this progress. And so I have felt in my career that it's important to, as Mrs. Higginbotham Adams said in her excellent narrative, she wanted to be where people were that looked like her. I understand that and feel that way in part myself, but I think it's very important to be where people don't look like you. Because it's only by sharing space, sharing meals, breaking bread, that we learn about one another and learn that humans are humans. My faith tells me we are made in the image of God, and that means whatever your color is, or my color, anybody else's color, somehow there's that God presence, and it's our obligation to try to find it. If you stay in your own, what you call, group all the time, I think you don't fully discover God. And that works on both sides. So when I worked so hard at the medical school here to rectify the injustice of a poor admission rate for underrepresented minorities, my aim wasn't just to get Black and other underrepresented students so Blacks could see Blacks, or Black patients could see Black doctors, but so that white people could see competent Black people. And that Black people could see not every white person is a devil, and that white people could see that not every Black person is something negative. So it's complex, but certainly I've observed that this legacy we have in this country has hurt so many people in so many deep ways, and we're still trying to figure it out.
Well, Dr. Evans, so far you have mentioned slavery and the legacy of that peculiar institution in America. You've mentioned civil rights. You didn't mention affirmative action, but you mentioned some actions that you took while at Case Western Reserve University, perhaps. I don't know if we call that leveling the playing field, but acting affirmatively to attract a diverse body of
Yes.
students. So when do you become a doctor, and when do you start that kind of work, recognizing that there is this legacy and that we have to deal with it in a positive way?
Well, just as I told you earlier that I thought I was called to be a doctor, I'm not elevating me, I'm telling you the only way I could make sense of it, that at 4 I'm saying I'm going to be a doctor. Actually, the first day I came to medical school here at Case Western Reserve University, I met someone who has been a lifelong friend now ever since then, Dr. David Satcher, who was one of our Surgeon Generals. He was Black and from Anniston, Alabama. So we're looking around the first day and saying, how come there's so few of us here? So from the first day I was concerned. I wasn't even a doctor, but I was saying, this doesn't feel right. And so we began talking with the dean. And we'd say to the dean, how come it looks like this here? And the dean would say, well, Ed Jackson, Dave Satcher, and you are the only competitive ones. We said, well, that's not true. And we would say that to him. That's not true. And we kept that up. Now, David was in the MD, PhD program, so we were together only 1 year, and then he had to go on another bifurcation addressing the educational requirements of the PhD part. So we didn't work so closely after that, but he and I were very active that first year in CORE and Cleveland Tutorial Project. We walked from the campus here to Huff, to Glenville to teach, kids, tutor them. We were dragged out of the Board of Education in our protest for the gerrymandering that was going on with the schools here. So, this started, well, like with the object lesson of my aunt, with Paul Robeson. We, of course, had enslaved relatives, and my grandmother would tell us stories about these, what we thought of as great people. One of whom escaped slavery by killing the master. And there was an uprising of slaves, which was very common. You don't hear about it much in history books, but there were some people who just weren't going to be slaves. And I have said myself, I don't know how I could have done it. I would have either died or gotten free. So anyway, to address your question is, where did it start? I don't know where it started. I just came here with good trouble. Mm-hmm. Now, we weren't raising ruckuses. We were having civil discourse about these subjects. But I kept it up all 4 years of medical school. I kept asking, this has got to change. I went away after medical school to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and then came back, finished my residency. And then in 1971, the dean of the medical school called me up. He said, ever since you came to medical school here, you've been talking about this imbalance we have in our admissions. I want you to come over here and fix it. I said, well, maybe you've not noticed, Dr. Robbins, but I'm in a fellowship. I can't work full time on that. But I want to work on it. And I'll put the team together, and I'll work on weekends and at night. And that's exactly what happened. I went over to Metro and talked to Ed Jackson, who had a job. He was 2 years ahead of me. I don't know what his job was over there, but I said, Ed, whatever your job is here, the job at the medical school is more important. You've got to come over there, and we've got to get started on this because the door has opened, Now, Fred Robbins is an example of a truly great leader, person of courage. He knew this was long past due, and he was going to do something about it through us. And so we put together a program. I wrote a grant for $500,000, which was a lot of money back then in 1971. It's a lot of money now, but in order to put this program together, to attract students, to put out the word, to travel, we had a special program we put together called a post-baccalaureate program to try to bring up the readiness of some students that we thought could do it, but they weren't quite ready. Turned out that didn't work. We learned that when you've had certain levels of deprivation, you're not going to make up for it in a year's time. But that wasn't a problem. We were able to find great young people out there, as we know we would. And so within 2 years, we had gone from 1% to 2% underrepresented minorities per class to over 15%. And that remains today. It's a little different today because some of the people recruited of color are, like from the Caribbean. Ed Jackson would say, yes, they're color, but I can't pronounce their names. And what he meant was, why have we not continued to be successful in finding people from our city or from Detroit or from Chicago or whatever? So there's still an issue there, I think. But the classes don't look anything like they did when we first came here. So, and of course, all of this intentionality, I don't know, I just got it from my family. I mean, this is what you do. You don't get born and just waste your time on frivolous stuff. You're supposed to work hard and try to achieve something, not just for yourself, but for others.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for getting us into the decade of the 1970s. And then that red letter date, 1971, when the dean calls on you to do something about this problem at our alma mater, Case Western Reserve University.
Yes.
I'm not a medical doctor, but I know something about the history of that institution as being rather progressive. Almost 200 years now, since 1826.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask also, again, about CORE, because when we get into the 70s, for some of the history that you're associated with, there are lots of acronyms. So the CORE, what kind of organization is that you were working with?
Congress on Racial Equality.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted that on the record.
Yes.
That it is.
Yeah, we joined that. There was a Black Panthers party here. So Dave Satcher and I said, well, let's go over there and see what they're doing. We walked in the room and there were all these guns all over the place and we ran right out, so we didn't get involved with the Black Panthers. But we were with the NAACP and CORE and the local efforts, like the Bruce Klunder story, I think you know about that. And so the University of Chicago prepared me magnificently. I worked hard, I studied, but I had time to do these things. In college I didn't have so much time. I was busy mastering all this University of Chicago material, which really strengthened me. And two of my high school teachers will go back, like good novels, they don't go through a stream of just one year after another. You do one thing, then you take a flashback. But two of my teachers at Parker High School had been graduates of the University of Chicago. And 1959 was the Darwin Centennial. And they were all recognizing me and my sister and others in our high school class that had potential for goodness. I didn't say greatness, but goodness. They took us to the campus all the time over there. And that's how I fell in love with the University of Chicago. And I owe so much to them. As I told you, I've had so many great teachers. But anyway, I don't know where we left off, something about CORE. And I told you what Congress of Racial Equality.
Yeah, which I think is a very important point that you were making, but you were there on the front line. I remember reading some of those stories about people at the Board of Education and challenging the segregationist practices,
yes, exactly,
of the public school leaders here.
Yeah, they were gerrymandering. They were building schools that were totally unnecessary in order to keep black kids fixed in a neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the name of the Reverend Bruce Klunder. Is there more that you can say about his story?
Well, yes, he was part of this movement to not have segregation. And one of these sites that they were building that was totally unnecessary, he was there protesting one day. And David and I were on our way, so we didn't actually witness what I'm going to tell you. We came just after. But he was positioned behind a excavation machine. And the driver didn't see him. I mean, everybody was convinced this was not intentional, but he drove over him and killed him right on the spot. And he was a youth pastor associated with the youth movement that was with the Church of the Covenant, Presbyterian. So it was such a great sadness for our city. It was national, international news. They built the school anyway, but so our being dragged out was nothing compared to being killed. His wife remained in town until her retirement, so she was here many years and had many friends, and everybody knew the story. But as I say, the guy, it was thoroughly investigated. He was not in any way trying to murder anybody. He didn't see him, and I don't think Bruce Klunder, Reverend Klunder, was aware either of what was happening. I mean, it was just an awful thing. A tragedy born from a tragedy.
And may I say also for the record that CORE was not a Black nationalist organization.
Oh, no.
It was an integrated.
Yes.
Racial equality, but certainly all races.
Exactly.
Involved. Okay, just wanted to get that on the record.
Yeah.
Because you experienced it. I've
Yeah.
read about it in books, but I wanted to hear that in your voice.
Well, I think whatever aspect you take from the civil rights movement, And if you look carefully at the ministry of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he wasn't just preaching to black people, he was preaching to all people. And if you look at those marches in the South, they were integrated. When you look at the current shootings and the marches that have come up as a result, you see many more white people involved. And I think that's required. I say in my church, you know, stop asking black people to tell you how much we've been hurt. Stand up and say how much the society has hurt us. White people have to talk. And that's what Fred Robbins was doing. He was saying the time has come. And he had a very hard time. I need to go back to that. White faculty, many of them, you know, were outraged with him, wanting us to do that work to increase the numbers of underrepresented minority students. The guy who admitted me to the school, whom I loved, I mean, there's a story there too, but he said to me, right to me, "You're going to ruin everything I've done to make this an excellent medical school with what you're doing." I said, "You're wrong." Now, he had the fullness and grace 3 years later to come and say he was sorry. But every day, Fred Robbins practically was getting calls about it. And, you know, he would say, "Well, you're entitled to think what you think, but this is what we're going to do."
Okay.
There are very few people like that. And he didn't interfere at all with what we were doing. I mean, he wanted to let us lead it because he knew we knew what to do.
Dr. Evans, when you talk about those experiences with CORE and with Case Western Reserve University, when I think about the geography, including where we are right now, I'm thinking Greater Glenville. Would you agree with how I'm drawing the boundaries, perhaps?
I don't know quite what you mean by it, but sure.
Well, I say Greater Glenville because St. Clair Superior, East 105th. People don't usually challenge me when I say, you know, when those streets intersect, you know, East 105th, definitely Glenville.
Yeah.
But technically, I think the Western Reserve Historical Society's Cleveland History Center, also Greater Glenville. But I want to ask about some of the other acronyms, if I may, that are associated with your work.
Yes.
In the Greater Glenville
Please.
community. And I have two here. Mm-hmm. One is rather new to me in my study of that community, and it's Project Might. Can you tell me a little bit about your work with that initiative?
Yes, I'm going to take a personal privilege and credit for that. I mean, I love to make acronyms. So I came up with that. What we were doing, part of my childhood dreaming was to work in and or establish a health center that was of such excellence that people from everywhere would want to come. That's what I was saying as a child. My favorite cousin, sadly, who's long been deceased, said to me one day, this is when maybe I was 8 or something, "I've never known anybody who's got all these plans." But so I had that plan, that desire. But of course I had so many, you know, there are goals, and then you have to have goal ladders, and I had so many steps to make. That sort of was not uppermost in my mind most of the time. But somehow, concomitantly with the work at the medical school, this dream of this health center started reawakening. And I started talking to colleagues about it, black and white. One of them was Ed Jackson. Another was Dave Miller. Dave Miller was with Huff Norwood, which became Neon. And he was one of the founders there, and that had started long before Project Might. But I knew he knew tools of building institutions. So I talked with many, many people. And I developed a group of what I would call dream catchers. We knew the poverty of Glenville. I had had families living in Glenville in the 50s when it was a prosperous black neighborhood. So my acquaintance with Glenville had gone back a long way, and but I had kept up with it peripherally. So I knew it had fallen on really hard times. And we did some studying of that, and were able to document just how, despite Forest City Hospital, the service and quality of service to the really poor, largely Medicaid, Medicare-dependent people needed attention. And so I started dreaming, churning out things, sharing them with people. Oh, yes, we can do this. And so then we learned of the Glenville Health Association, which had started, I think, in 1970. We started talking. We started having a dialogue. And the Glenville Health Association, which the executive director of that was Evelyn Wisham. She was an RN. And we began having meetings with Forest City Hospital, Glenville Health Association, and Project Might. And Project Might was represented officially by myself, by Ed Jackson, by the School of Medicine. And what we were saying is, we can put together the professional arm of this and get this done. Finally, we came to an agreement that Project Might would be the implementing arm. So the story is, I sent you recently materials about Homer Wadsworth that really document how hard it was to raise the money for it. Forest City Hospital owned the building that we rehabbed, but we needed to raise the money for all the interior improvements and exterior improvements. It was a terrible eyesore for the community. We turned it into like a palace, not in any exorbitant way. It was a simply elegant building. And we stayed within budget, and I was known as the, they gave me some name. Anyway, it was the overseer. I went every day to look at. We had a temporary office right across the street. So I went every day to look at what the contractors were doing and caught a few mistakes, and it turned out beautifully. And we had a black contractor, Aaron Johnson. He was magnificent. I mean, he was a carpenter by trade, but he knew something about all of the trades. And he had such pride. He wanted it to be perfect. And, you know, he was just a jewel. And I just got to know so many wonderfully good people, talented people, caring people from many backgrounds and races. So it was a thrill. So, it was, you know, there are a lot of steps I haven't told you about because we could be here 3 days. But the point is, we got all these groups together in harmony. And what we got one grant ultimately, even though I've been knocking for a long time at the Cleveland Foundation. Homer Wadsworth came along. He became a dream catcher, and we got money from the Cleveland Foundation. Then I wrote a big grant for money from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and had the great joy and privilege of meeting Maggie Mahoney, who was an independently very wealthy woman, but she had a social consciousness that was so unusual. And her thing was healthcare, improving healthcare in the United States. And right away, she became a dream catcher. She loved the grant application. And I must say, I've been trying to get a hold of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to get a copy of that grant application because it's probably in one of the 100 boxes in my basement. But if I've hoarded anything, I don't hoard, except papers. I've got papers, and I've got to go through them. But anyway, it's not easy to get in touch with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but I don't give up. But back then, I got in touch with them, met her, we became friends, and they gave us a grant of almost $400,000. So we put together the pieces, the money, opened in September of 1974. So many wonderful people, Jefferson Jones, Richard Wertman, Ed Jackson, who stayed 3 years with the project. Joanne Wilson was a social worker. Charlene Higginbotham, of course. I decided to leave after 11 years of total involvement. And I'll just tease you a little bit. When the staff got so large I couldn't remember people's names, I said, it's time for me to go. I think there were 40 staff people when I left. And it just grew magnificently and attracting people from, as I said, different backgrounds. And it was, and the people were just, they really did catch the dream. They wouldn't leave a piece of paper on the floor. If they saw a piece of paper on the floor, they'd pick it up. One day I was out front sweeping up, and Richard Bean, who was the board chair, came up, and he got really upset with me. He said, "What are you doing out here?" I said, "Well, I'm sweeping up." He said, "Well, haven't you heard of RIP, R.I.P.?" And of course, I thought he was talking about rest in peace, and I wasn't dead. But, so I said, "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Bean. Would you please tell me?" And he said, "Well, rank has its privilege." I said, "There's some truth to that, but it's also important that leaders make it clear that they don't have disdain for honest work. And if there's an emergency and there's no one available, and I happen to be available, then I'm going to take care of it. If I'm out here all day, every day, sweeping up the sidewalk, then obviously you have the wrong executive director." And he knew. We were okay. There was no problem. But we had just marvelous people. Mrs. Battles, who lived in Central, she came on the bus every day. She was the housekeeper. And no matter what time I got there, because those were the days when I went to work at 6:30 or 7, she was always there before me. I never could figure it out how she came by bus. And she wasn't entirely healthy, that was the kind of dedication that we had in all the staff. I think in all the time I was there, I terminated only 2 people.
And Dr. Evans, then, again, for the record, we're spelling MIGHT, M-I-G-H-T.
Movement for Improved Glenville Health Today.
Okay. All right. Sometimes with the acronyms, we leave out a letter or two, but
No,
again,
movement.
each one means
Well,
something.
the F isn't represented, but it's Movement for Improved Glenville Health Today.
Okay. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And then I am discovering now, because of records that have been digitized at Case Western Reserve, how intertwined the histories were for Forest City Hospital, for MIGHT, and also for the Glenville Health Association, GHA. So was that intentional from day one, knowing that Forest City started earlier? It has a history that dates back to the 1950s. But did you go into Project MIGHT knowing that there would be this close relationship with the Forest City Hospital?
Yes, I'm glad you brought me back to that, because I forgot one thing about Maggie Mahoney. She came and visited. And it was very interesting because she, as I said, she had become our dream catcher. She understood it, that what service it would be and the need for it. But at that time, concomitantly with our application, the medical school separately had made an application for some project at the medical school. They didn't get the money. We were awarded the grant. And she said, "You may be wondering how the big medical school didn't get their grant and you got it." And she said, "It's because your grant application made so clear your understanding of collaboration and your commitment to it." So yes, we had a collaborative relationship with the Glenville Health Association. And in fact, the project became the Glenville Health Association. MIGHT was dropped. And we had collaboration with Forest City Hospital. We had collaboration with the church down the street, St. Aloysius Church, Catholic Church. At that time, I was Roman Catholic, and Father Burns was the head priest, and he became a friend of the project. Many of our large, for example, we had a maybe 5th anniversary celebration. We had held it there. A. Grace Lee Mims sang. Dean Robbins was there. So many people. Dean Robbins was sitting at the diocese, dais, and when Grace began to sing, he said, "Oh my God, you know, let's just." She was at her peak at that time, and just was amazing. But the collaboration is what I wanted to get at. And we knew we had to go, nobody single-handedly could do this. The big institutions had to be involved. We immediately got staff privileges at Forest City. Every physician had privileges at Forest City. We made many admissions to Forest City. But we alone couldn't keep that hospital full, and ultimately the census dropped, and it wasn't a hospital that could take extremely ill people, So we were sad when it closed in '78, but it contributed for the time it was there. And I think when I left Glenville Health Association, it was a huge decision. It was many factors involved with it. But I was talking with my psychotherapist about it, and I was crying, and just, the issue was, is this the right decision? Is it time for me to go? We were doing very well. The revenues from patient care were covering expenses. So I felt I was leaving in a good place. But I loved it. I had spent, first the early childhood dream, practically all of my life about this center. But what he said, the therapist, was, no, it won't be the same. But it will be there. It will keep giving a service to the community. Something we started. So, I was able to, in time, to have a perspective about it and stop crying and laugh and, remember all the good things, the services that were given there. And even to this day, I'll run into people who remember it. They remember it was a place of compassion, of excellence, of dignity. So clean you could eat off the floor. I mean, they say just marvelous things, even though it closed. Now, it closed 7 years after I left, and I don't know the details of that. But I can tell you what made it successful for the time I was there. And that is, it attracted people who were much more concerned about the mission and vision than about their own self-aggrandizement or profit. So yes, we paid people enough, but we didn't pay them what the marketplace would have paid them. We couldn't. You couldn't have a population that was 70 to 85% Medicaid, Medicare, and be paying huge salaries. We made enough, but it wasn't luxuriant by any means. And we also we were partners. The other collaboration was with the National Health Service Corps. So we got physicians, not all of them, but some of them we didn't pay, the government paid them. So, but that meant usually that they were there 3 years and then they left. And there's a disadvantage to that. But there's a huge advantage in that you have less call on money.
We are here in this space today because the current exhibition, the backdrop for our discussion today, is this idea of community-based healthcare. And I know what comes to my mind as a historian when I say community-based. I'm an East Sider. I'm a native Clevelander. Clevelanders are interesting when they talk about East Side versus West Side. But you're from Chicago, and you started out by talking about South Side. But did you go to Project Might, or did Project Might come into existence with this idea that this is going to be in the community, serving people who live in this community, or was it there for everyone who could make their way to Glenville?
Well, that's an excellent question, because I want to talk about that. First of all, the project was for the residents, primarily, to improve their health outcomes. And we had done a survey prior to opening that had many purposes. One was to inform the community that we were there. We were coming for them. To get their input, what was important to them. So we learned through that what are now called the social determinants of healthcare. That yes, they wanted healthcare, but they wanted jobs. They wanted money, they wanted better education, they wanted a lot of things that were more important to them even than healthcare. So we learned about that. The other thing that's very important, it was for education. We wrote curriculum for the medical school for the training of medical students. So we had students. And why did we want students? We wanted students because we wanted them to know about care of the poor. But you may remember that I said earlier, my dream as a child was it would be so excellent that people would come from everywhere, every color, and that was true. 15% of our patients came from the suburbs. And that helped our income too, because they had insurances, usually not Medicaid. And so it had many facets, I think. And I loved the teaching part. I mean, the curriculum, I mean, that I was an academic at that point. I later changed to the clinical track because it seemed more pertinent. But, you know, to write the curriculum and have it approved by the Departments of Internal Medicine and Pediatrics and Family Medicine and have students with us all the time was a great pride for us. Not just for me, but for everybody. Yeah. And we started right away, by the way, with a social worker full-time. We had a clinical psychologist, I think 12 hours a week. We knew the needs of this community, and we knew that having those people there, rather than having to refer them somewhere, was going to improve the opportunity for them to get care. You know, not have to catch a bus to go over here to see that person over there. And that's exactly how it worked.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that bus, because I discovered, after focusing, in my mind at least, and putting together the outline, so much on Glenville and so much on Forest City Hospital, that when we talk about the Black hospital movement in Greater Cleveland, or certainly Cleveland proper, there's something going on the west side with City Hospital. And also something going on the east side with people like Dr. Ulysses G. Mason.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and Glenville. And so it's been interesting. This isn't a huge exhibition, but it reflects both the Glenville analysis of the hospital, the Black hospital movement's impact on the east side, and also what's happening at City Hospital and what eventually becomes Metropolitan General Hospital, and now is Metro Health. But were you aware of all of that east side, west side dynamic?
Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I used to say, well, all the politics now around these hospitals, it was the same back then. You know, it's like, now the only difference is, when I came to medical school in 1963, the Cleveland Clinic was one building. One little white building, that little white building that's on, if you go in the circle to the main entrance, to your right is that white building. That was the Cleveland Clinic. So it's astronomical what has happened with it. But the big players were university hospitals and Metro. And I used to say, I mean, they were arguing all the time, excuse the French, but they used to say, how come they just can't be, this was a young, 20-year-old, not understanding anything about it. Why can't they just be University Metro East and University Metro West? Why can't people just love each other, Well, later I understood a lot better about it. But you couldn't help but be aware. I mean, we had clinical exercises over there. We heard people talking. Mostly people were fine. I mean, it was Metro Health, now Metro Health, was where I wanted to do every one of my clinical clerkships. The teaching was superior by far to any other place. And not only the teaching, but the illustration of compassion. The group that was most served there were Appalachians, West Virginians. Certainly Black people always felt invited there, welcome there. I want to say a little bit more, though. I'm not sure how much more time we have, but I want to say, some of you might be listening to all of this and saying, well, why did you need to do what you did? There was Forest City Hospital that had outpatient capability, inpatient capability. The truth is, most of the black doctors, well, I think I may have said this earlier, half of the doctors at Forest City Hospital were white, okay? Now, I don't know what patients they saw, really, to tell the truth. I just don't know. I may have known at some point. But the doctors mostly didn't see the patients in Glenville. They saw people from the suburbs. They weren't being served. The patients in Glenville, the abjectly poor patients, were by and large not being served by the doctors at the hospital. Because, you know, there were a lot of them. I mean, 40-something doctors, maybe more. And we started with 3 physicians and 2 dentists. I mean, it grew. We had an OBGYN ultimately. So we wanted to hone in, while we wanted to be so good that others would want to come, we wanted our group, target group, to be the abjectly poor of Glenville.
Again, I will say this, and I grew up riding buses on the east side to go to schools. From my working poor neighborhood to middle class black neighborhood, further up Kinsman, close to the Shaker Heights border. So those boundaries are real too, within the race. So there's that kind of diversity. But, and I don't know that if people were sick in Glenville, that they would have funding for bus fare, especially after the uprising in 1968, to get to the west side, near west side, to the city hospital.
I think in some cases they didn't, but they had friends. One of the problems around that was many not having transportation, but friend Sally down the street said, I'll pick you up, and they're 2 hours late picking him up. So it caused trouble for sure. But that was one of the social determinants of health care. You know, they don't have a bus fare.
And Dr. Evans, I also want to say, because I saw some of those pictures of you and Dr. Jackson when you were working at the Glenville Health Association. You were a very young woman with this dream of transforming healthcare in that community that had lots of challenges that they were trying to overcome. But did you face any discrimination based on the fact that you were so young?
Occasionally some parent would say, are you sure you're old enough to be a doctor? You know, stuff like that. I don't think people were focusing on that. I think they were focusing on whether I knew what to do. And one thing I knew what to do was to make friends who could help me and how to ask for help. Fred Robbins became like a surrogate father. He told my mother when she visited here once, Fred Robbins was the dean of the medical school, that I was like one of his daughters. I mean, I had friends who lifted me up. When Ed Jackson left, it was really hard because, you know, we had both committed to staying at least 5 years. And Maggie Mahoney, you know, was right there with encouragement. And Richard Tompkins, who was our program officer at the Cleveland Foundation, you know, wrote a lovely note and said, probably seems like to you, like you've fallen off a horse. You haven't, just keep riding. And and you know, nothing beats preparation. I mean, I had exquisite preparation from my family, as I've had to try to make clear, from teachers. I could go on and on about these Greek teachers. And then from friends I made and colleagues, like Fred Robbins. I mean, he was, and there are others like him. So I feel so blessed. I mean, I wasn't out there by myself or even thinking I should be by myself. And when I gave you the list of all these people, you know, that's because they were pivotal. The head of the lab was a man from India. I've never known a smarter lab technologist. He had an advanced degree in that. He could run the lab. He was licensed. But, he was just phenomenal. So, yeah, I was young, but it's okay. I was born old.
Getting into good trouble at an early age.
I believed in it. I just think yeah. My sister got into a little argument, and this is when we were in Queens, Long Island, New York. One of our neighbors was William Grayson, who was a managing editor for Ebony magazine. And he had a kid that was about our age, and the little boy was menacing my sister in some way. This is the only fight I think I've actually had, physical fight in my life. And, we were 8 or 9 or something. So I picked him up by the collar and threw him across the lawn and told him to leave my sister alone. But I didn't settle disputes like that. I mean, I'll tell you this little story. When I was interviewed by the chairman of the board for Cleveland Trust Bank, they wanted me to come on the board. So he came to the Glenville Health Association because I told him I had so much work, it was hard to get downtown. And he said, would he be happy to come out and meet with me? So I said, well, why do you want me on the board? What is it? And he said, well, I know you from what I learned to be a person of conviction and clarity, and yet you have a sense of justice. And he said, we need that. But we know you'll do it in a way without standing on a table and shooting at us. So I like that. I mean, I'm not incapable of being strident or having discourse across difficult subject matters. But I try to do it carefully. I'm not perfect at it, but I was perfect enough. Got along at the bank quite well. He was stopped downtown Cleveland one day and asked by a woman on the National City Bank board, well, how's Doris doing? He said, well, we love her very much. She asks questions we don't want to hear sometimes, but ones we need to hear. And that, to me, that was a compliment. And I'm still doing it.
I'm really enjoying this interview, but I'm just trying to understand how you're doing all of this. You're a faculty member, you're running the Glenville Health Association.
And
you have a
patients.
private practice as well?
No, at that time, I had my patients were at the Glenville Health Association.
Okay.
I spent about 60% time in administration and 40% time seeing patients. Of course, I did work at night. I was full-time professional. I think I was, I don't know, as I told you, I would get there at 6:30 or 7. I often didn't leave until 6:30 or 7. And, but that was my life. That's what I wanted. And as I said, I had so many people who were dream catchers. They wanted to do it too. They were working hard also. This H. Frank Anderson, whose name I've given you, is a white man. He was the OBGYN doctor. People loved him. He was like 6 feet 3 inches tall. Handsome guy with a lovely wife. I think they had 2 children at that time. They had had a child to die, which was a sadness, before he had come to Glenville Health. But he was just, everybody there was just splendid. I wasn't, well, it was Charlotte Higginbotham, Frank Anderson, Richard Wordman, John Wilson, Carl Norman, who was one of the dentists. I didn't have to stand over people. I wasn't doing that. So I found people, I was fortunate enough to have people who loved this work, who loved it, who could see the benefit of it to the community, who loved the teaching, who could see the benefit of it to the students. So it was just so fulfilling. I can't, and I was on multiple boards. I did finally learn how to say no. People would ask me, oh, you're the one who can do it. I said, well, I can't do it. And then what I learned is, they'll tell you, you're the only one who can do this. And then 3 days later, they found somebody else.
There's a study that's about 150 pages long. It's a Glenville area study related to healthcare. I tried to find that. I looked that up when I got your note, and I couldn't open anything. Okay, I'll send you the link or the PDF. I can attach it to an email if you think you have time to take a look at it. But
I
it's,
want to take a look at it.
yeah, just before the hospital was about to close in early 1978.
78, yeah.
You know, the consultants who came in, you know, to do all of the analysis, they kept mentioning your name. It's like, well, you can try to do this, but you have to check with Dr. Doris Evans because she's running this, and this is in 1978. I said, oh, this is really interesting. And so, again, the collaboration was there. I mean, everybody knew technically you were with a different organization, but everybody felt every board member at Forest City Hospital needed to know who you were. And they needed to know that they were going to have to deal with you.
Well,
We're talking about closing a
well, we went to
hospital.
every staff meeting. We were on the staff, and we tried to be fully on the staff. I can remember many days going to the newborn nursery, seeing newborns. The other aspect of this, which was so interesting, Ed Jackson and I decided, well, he was going to teach me to be an internist, and I was going to teach him to be a pediatrician. Now, most internists, family medicine doctors, feel very insecure about seeing children, whereas pediatricians don't feel so insecure about seeing older people because we see people through such a long period of their lives, particularly pediatricians trained in the last 50 years. So in my practice, private practice that I later, after I left Glen Wallace, when I did my own practice, I would see patients through the second year of college. So you know, you followed patients with diabetes, cystic fibrosis, chronic diseases. But we did do a little of that. So it was a private model of care, so we were on call. That was the other part of it, you know. Every third or fourth night, we were on call. So I can remember getting a call about an 80-year-old had a stroke. I went and saw him, examined him, diagnosed him. He did initially go to Forest City, but he was so ill he had to go to UH. So that was another little twist to it, to the model. So because we wanted, when we were on call, to feel comfortable. So if I had a patient I didn't feel comfortable with, I would have called Ed, and he would have called me about a child. Yeah, I loved it. It was, I think it's important to have a life in which you can look back on it and feel like you made a contribution to others. And I still live it when I run into these people I'm telling you about. Oh yes, they remember Glenville Health Association. Some of them can even tell me the address.
Now, was it on Parkwood Drive or just near
St. Clair.
106
106 40
St. Clair? And the hospital, I think, was
That it
701
was in back.
Parkwood. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to put that in my phone and just go there now and see if I can get my bearings. You know, but again, that major thoroughfare, East 105th Street, within walking distance,
Yes.
there are all these things that are going on.
Yes.
You know, I want to say also, I thanked you for the names. It's a long list, but Wisham, Jackson, Mims, you know, I'll be able to cross-reference all of this material that you've shared today with what's in the archives at Case Western Reserve University, which was also the alma mater for A. Grace Lee Mims, the School of Library and Information Science.
Yeah.
But I thank you for the numbers also, because I want to ask you about measures of success. When you decided maybe it's time for you to leave the Glenville Health Association, how do you measure your success to that point? How do you know that you've done what you set out to do through Project Might?
Well, some of this is anecdotal, but something that's not anecdotal is the financial success. We had, as I said, we had an excess of revenue over expense. In a nonprofit, you're not supposed to talk about profit. So we had a modest excess of revenue over expenses. So to me, I was leaving it as a stable organization with no going concerns. We had a certified audit every year by Ernst & Young. One of the conditions that I made in taking the position of executive director, because at first I was business manager and director of pediatrics. When Evelyn Wisham left, that's when I became executive director. But I said, I won't take it unless we have a certified independent audit every year. I wanted the community to be able to have trust in us. And one implement for having that trust is an audit, and an audit in which you don't have the same findings every year. You know, there are no perfect audits, so the way you measure it is, okay, they cite you for this, and next year you've corrected that. But if you haven't corrected it, then that's bad news. But we never had that issue. We had a very high show rate. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was over 90% of people keeping their appointments. That's another indicator of success. We didn't have employees that were resigning. You know, mostly people stayed. And people just talked about it all the time. I mean, what good care they thought they got, with dignity. There were no rushed appointments. Back then, all of medicine was done differently from how it's done today. But I think we probably gave an hour for a new patient and 20 minutes for a sick visit, and gave employees discretion about how they appointed patients. We got so busy, we had to establish a separate walk-in clinic. We remodeled the front part of the front waiting room area, so that, and we assigned a physician to take the walk-in area. Each, I think it was by week or something like that. And that was to take overflow. People, you know, didn't have an appointment, but they were sick. And so I think there were a lot of indicators that we were doing what we said we would do. And we kept raising money. We kept being able to get grant money for special projects. We had some studies in hypertension that were going on. Yeah, so I think those were the kind of measures that we looked at. But, you know, even though I had some sadness in leaving, I did have joy of accomplishment. I mean, I think, you know, people felt pretty good about what they were doing every day there.
And Dr. Evans, perhaps in closing, I'd like to ask for a statement about this idea of collaboration. And I'm asking it because we started to think about this exhibit when we received a request from the Cleveland Council of Black Nurses. And I thought, okay, it's going to be all about nursing. And it was not. It is not. There is a kind of healthcare. It even forced us to change the name. You know, and it's not the Black Nurses exhibition. It is race, place, and community-based healthcare in Cleveland, Ohio. It's not just about Glenville anymore.
Yeah.
And so collaboration between medical doctors and LPNs like Charlene Higginbotham Adams and PhDs, all of these people are part of this history that you've recounted as a medical doctor. Was it that seamless that nurses and doctors and social workers were all working together?
Yeah.
In harmony in that period?
Oh, I think, well, that sort of makes another statement in terms of how did we know we were successful? And one of it was harmony. We did have harmony. It wasn't perfect. I mean, I can tell you, you know, we had a couple of things that weren't harmonious. But that wasn't, the prevailing mood was joy. People loved what they were doing. I mean, they could just see it. They could see the appreciation from the patient. They appreciated the patient, trusting them. The staff members trusted each other. In other words, if there were a patient who needed social services, you know, Dr. Wortman, the psychologist, or I, or Dr. Anderson, the OBGYN doctor, or Carl Norman, the dentist, we could just knock on Joanne Wilson's door and sit down and chat. And as I said, it was such a wonderful thing to have them in place. We knew that we needed that. We couldn't just be trying to get them referred over here because that would lose them. There's great attrition in doing that. So that was built into the budget to have these people on board the first day so that we could give this comprehensive, multi-specialty, private care, is what we called it. So Maggie Mahoney was talking about that kind of intra collaboration. She was also talking about the outside collaboration between GHA and the medical school, GHA and the church. You see, anybody who wanted to be a partner, we were a partner. And I don't mean that frivolously. I mean if there was something substantive that they had to offer. In fact, one day, George Forbes walked in. Now, you know that name, of course. And our videographer hopefully knows that name, George Forbes. But anyway, he says, "Where's Dr. Evans?" So they come running back trying to find me. "Oh, George Forbes is here. George Forbes is here." Okay, yeah. What? "Oh, he wants to see you. He wants to see you." So I slow walk my way up there, and there he is. I can't, for a lot of reasons, tell you everything he said. But what he said is, while a lot of other people are talking about doing something for these folks and doing nothing, you guys are doing something. And I want to know why you haven't applied for a block grant. Well, I did then and still do now have disdain for political stuff. And I had discussed that with the board, that I didn't want to get involved with politicians. And I was explicit why. But what I said to him, I'll discuss this with the board. And if you can guarantee to me that we'll have to go through every hoop everybody else does, then I'll certainly recommend to the board that we consider it. So it worked out. We got a block grant.
An oral historian from Chicago by the name of Mr. Larry Crow, works with the history makers out of Chicago, described Mr. George Forbes, Esquire, attorney and politician, as probably the most influential politician, not Democrat or black or white, but the most influential, most powerful politician in the Midwest, not just the city of Cleveland, at the time of his oral history interview for the History Makers, which wasn't so very long ago, maybe 10, 12 years ago. But was he at that point in his career when he approached you about considering perhaps the difference that a block grant might make in shaping the history of the Glenville Health Association?
I don't think he was thinking exactly in those terms. I don't think but he just wanted to say, I appreciate what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And there's no way the city shouldn't say that. So I don't know if he thought of it in the details of, what difference it would make, except everybody needs money. I think he understood that. I don't remember. I think he was the city council president at the time that he came. Mm-hmm. And I certainly had high regard for many things he did. And yeah, I think he wanted to do good things. And I've become friends with his daughter, or one of his daughters, Helen Forbes Fields. She's a lovely lady. Yeah. At the YWCA.
Because I always knew those things about Mr. Forbes. Master power broker, president of city council for a very long time, and ran for mayor. Yes. And lost to someone who he had mentored, Michael White. Both of them are quite influential as history makers in the city of Cleveland, and with ties to Glenville. So
I knew Michael White better, I would say, mm-hmm. and was a pediatrician for his children. And he, of course, was from Glenville.
Yes.
Michael White, and our sort of careers were sort of in lockstep in a way. In fact, I'm having breakfast with him soon. He's working for the Mandel Foundation, so he's still active, like I am.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful interview. I can't say conversation. It's your life story. It's your interview. So we thank you for everything that you shared with us today. And thank you for making it easier for me to tell a story about Glenville. I didn't, and growing up, I didn't know a whole lot about the Glenville community. And I grew up on the east side,
Well,
lower end of Kinsman, but Glenville's very east. But I knew nothing about the riots when they were happening. Or now we just say uprising in 1968. I should have remembered that. I remember a lot of things from 1968, including the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I do not remember the uprising in Glenville in the summer of '68. I learned about that by reading history books. But you lived a lot of that history. So thank you for making it easier. Thank you also for being a golfer. I've been trying to tell the story of another golfer, Mr. Robert Prince Madison, since 2021. I'm still working on that. But this project, I think, with its Glenville connections and
I've played golf with Bob a few
yes.
times.
Okay, so this is going to help, I think, to tell a fuller history about Glenville and the ties not only that you and Charlene Higginbotham Adams have to that community, but also Mr. Robert Prince Madison as an architect and his ties to the Medical Associates building
Yeah.
on East 105th Street that opened in 1963, the year that you started medical school.
It's been so many years. Half of the principals or more have died. So I'm very glad we could talk before I die, because I think, well, we're all going to die. So, but it's meaningful to me, to be able to elevate this, not me, all of us who did it. And there were just so many people. You said, how did I do it all? Well, I'll repeat, I didn't do it all by myself. I did a lot, but so did a lot of other people, and without whom it just could not have been possible.